The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty settlement of Willow Creek, a town barely worthy of the name with its handful of weather-beaten buildings and a single dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. 17-year-old Sarah Mae Whitmore knelt by the riverbank, her worn calico dress soaked at the hem as she scrubbed her only other garment against the smooth river stones. The water ran clear and cold, carrying the scent of mountain snow and wild sage. Sarah Mae had been alone for 3 months now, ever since consumption claimed her father, the town's only blacksmith. Her mother had died birthing her younger brother 2 years prior, and little Tommy had followed their mother to the grave before his second birthday. The townspeople had been kind enough in their way, leaving occasional baskets of bread or vegetables on her doorstep, but charity wore thin when winter stretched long and their own families needed feeding. The sound of splashing upstream caught her attention. Through the morning mist that clung to the water's surface, she saw a figure struggling in the shallows. As the mist parted, she could make out an elderly native man, his long gray braids hanging wet against his buckskin shirt. He favored his left leg heavily, using a makeshift walking stick cut from river willow. Each step through the rocky ford seemed to cost him dearly, his weathered face tight with pain and determination. Sarah Mae had been taught to fear the tribes that roamed these lands. Stories of raids and scalping parties were common currency in towns like Willow Creek. But watching this old man struggle alone against the current, she saw only someone in need. Her father had always said that kindness was the one thing that cost nothing to give, but was worth more than gold to receive. Setting down her washing, she waded into the cold water without hesitation. The current tugged at her skirts as she approached the elder, who had stopped midstream, his dark eyes watching her with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Sir, you look like you could use some help," Sarah Mae said softly, extending her hand toward the elderly man. The river babbled around them, and she could feel the smooth stones shifting beneath her bare feet. The old man studied her face for a long moment. Deep lines mapped the geography of his years, and his eyes held the depth of someone who had seen much joy and much sorrow. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, touched with an accent that spoke of a different mother tongue. "You are not afraid, little sparrow?" he asked, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "Should I be?" Sarah Mae replied, keeping her hand extended. "My pa always said fear was just another name for not understanding something yet." A ghost of a smile crossed the elder's features. "Your father was wise. I am called Gray Wolf Walking. My leg." He gestured to his injured limb. "A horse fell on it 3 days past. The bones grind like millstones." Without another word, Sarah Mae positioned herself beside him, allowing him to lean on her shoulder. Together they made their way slowly across the remaining distance to the far bank. She could feel the tremor in his muscles with each step, the way he bit back sounds of pain. When they finally reached the muddy shore, Gray Wolf Walking sank down onto a fallen log, breathing heavily. "There's a doctor in town," Sarah Mae offered. But Gray Wolf Walking shook his head. "My people wait for me in the high meadows. I must reach them before the moon is full, or they will think me dead and move on to winter grounds." He looked at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "But I will not forget this kindness, little sparrow. The river has witnessed what you have done." Sarah Mae helped him fashion a better walking stick from a sturdy piece of driftwood and shared what little cornbread she had brought for her midday meal. As Gray Wolf Walking prepared to continue his journey, he reached into a small leather pouch at his waist and withdrew something that caught the morning light. In Gray Wolf Walking's weathered palm lay a small pendant, carved from what looked like white stone, but gleamed with an inner light. The carving depicted a soaring bird with outstretched wings, so intricate that each feather seemed ready to flutter in the breeze. "This belonged to my grandmother's grandmother," he said, pressing the pendant into Sarah Mae's reluctant hands. She told stories of the first white travelers who came not as conquerors but as friends. "This stone remembers kindness and calls to those who would answer." Sarah Mae tried to protest, but Gray Wolf Walking closed her fingers around the pendant. "The spirits of the river have already accepted this trade, little sparrow. To refuse would be to insult them." She fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling its strange warmth against her chest. Gray Wolf Walking rose slowly, testing his weight on the makeshift crutch. "Why do you call me little sparrow?" Sarah Mae asked as she helped steady him. "Because sparrows are small, but they are not weak," he replied. "They know when to sing and when to be silent. They know when to fly and when to stay. And when winter comes, they remember where kindness lives, and they return with their songs." With great effort, Gray Wolf Walking began making his way along the deer path that led up into the wooded hills. Sarah Mae watched until his figure disappeared into the dappled shadows beneath the pine trees, then gathered her washing and started back toward town. The pendant seemed to pulse gently against her throat, warm as a heartbeat. She spent the afternoon mending a tear in her father's old work shirt, the one she wore when the nights grew cold. The settlement remained quiet except for the usual sounds of chickens scratching in the dirt and the distant ring of hammer on anvil from the temporary forge that traveling smiths sometimes used. As evening approached, dark clouds began gathering on the western horizon, promising rain or perhaps something worse. Sarah Mae woke to the thunder of hoofbeats and harsh voices shouting in the pre-dawn darkness. She pressed herself against the single window of her small cabin, peering through a gap in the flour sack curtains. 5 riders had stopped in the middle of the settlement's main street, their horses snorting and pawing the earth. Even in the dim light, she could see they were heavily armed, with rifles across their saddles and gun belts slung low on their hips. The leader was a tall man with a black beard and a hat pulled low over his eyes. His voice carried clearly in the still air as he addressed the few townspeople who had emerged from their homes. "Name's Jake Murdoch, and these are my boys," he announced. "We're looking for supplies and maybe some hospitality, the kind you don't ask to be paid for." Old Pete Henley, who ran the general store, stepped forward with his hands visible and empty. "We don't have much, mister, but we're willing to share what we can spare." Murdoch's laugh was like breaking glass. "That's mighty generous of you, old man. See, we've had a hard ride, and hard men need comfort. My boys here have been sleeping rough for near a week." His gaze swept across the small cluster of buildings until it settled on Sarah Mae's cabin. "That place looks nice and cozy. Who lives there?" Sarah Mae's blood turned to ice water. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. The pendant around her neck suddenly felt burning hot against her skin, almost too hot to bear. Outside, she heard Pete Henley's voice, higher now with fear. "That's just a young girl, mister. An orphan. She ain't got nothing you'd want." "Oh, I think you'd be surprised what I want," Murdoch said, and Sarah Mae could hear the ugly grin in his voice. "Boys, I think we'll start our visit over there." The sound of spurs jangling came closer, and Sarah Mae pressed herself against the back wall of the cabin. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She gripped the pendant so tightly its edges cut into her palm, and she found herself whispering a prayer to any spirit that might be listening. The pendant around Sarah Mae's neck began to pulse with a light visible even through her thin nightgown, and suddenly she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The soft whistle of arrows cutting through air, followed by shouts of alarm from the outlaws. "What in tarnation?" Murdoch's voice cut off abruptly. Through her window, Sarah Mae saw figures emerging from the shadows like ghosts made flesh. Native warriors, their faces painted for war, moved with the fluid silence of hunting cats. They had appeared as if the very earth had given them birth, surrounding the outlaws with bows drawn and arrows nocked. At their head stood a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to Grey Wolf Walking, though his hair was still black as a raven's wing, and his movements spoke of coiled power rather than aged wisdom. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You will leave this place," he said simply. "Now." Murdoch wheeled his horse around, his hand dropping to his gun. "You red-skinned devil, this ain't your concern. We got business here." "Your business is with the dead if you do not go," the warrior replied. His English was perfect, with no trace of accent. Around him, his companions remained statue still, but their readiness was palpable as summer lightning. One of Murdoch's men, younger and clearly more nervous than his leader, tugged at his boss's sleeve. "Jake, there's maybe 20 of them. We didn't sign on for a war." "Shut up, Tommy," Murdoch snarled, but Sarah Mae could see uncertainty creeping into his posture. The odds had shifted dramatically, and even a man like Murdoch could count. The lead warrior took a step forward, and the moonlight caught the war paint streaking his cheekbones. "The woman in that cabin showed kindness to one of our elders. She is under our protection now. All who live in this place are under our protection. You have one chance to ride away. Choose wisely." Murdoch's horse shifted nervously beneath him, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. The outlaw leader's hand hovered over his gun butt, but Sarah Mae could see the calculation in his eyes. 5 men against 20 seasoned warriors in a fight they hadn't prepared for. The mathematics were simple and deadly. "This ain't over," Murdoch finally spat, but he was already reining his horse around. "Come on, boys. We'll find easier pickings elsewhere." The outlaws spurred their horses into a gallop, thundering out of town with the same suddenness they had arrived. But the warriors didn't relax their vigilance until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Only then did their leader approach Sarah Mae's cabin. She opened the door before he could knock, the pendant still glowing softly against her throat. In the moonlight, the resemblance to Grey Wolf Walking was even more pronounced. though this man carried himself with the bearing of a chief or war leader. "You are the little sparrow," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I am Running Bear, son of Grey Wolf Walking. My father told us of your kindness at the river crossing." Sarah Mae found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Is your father well?" "He lives, and his leg mends, thanks to the time you gave him to rest and the strength you lent him to cross the water." Running Bear's stern expression softened slightly. "He said you would not accept payment for your help, but the spirits of the river have their own way of settling debts." Behind him, the other warriors had begun to melt back into the shadows, as silently as they had appeared. But Sarah Mae noticed that several had taken up positions around the settlement's perimeter, clearly intending to maintain their watch. "You don't need to guard us," she said. "Those men are gone now." Running Bear shook his head. "Men like those are wolves. They circle back when they think the shepherd sleeps. We will watch until the sun rises 3 times. It is the way of things." For 3 days and nights, the Lakota warriors maintained their silent vigil around Willow Creek. Sarah Mae saw them sometimes, shadows moving through the timber or the glint of eyes watching from a rocky outcrop, but they remained as unobtrusive as spirits. The townspeople went about their business with a mixture of relief and nervous energy, unused to having such protection but grateful for it nonetheless. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah Mae woke to find Running Bear sitting on the stump that served as her front step, his war paint replaced by simpler markings and his manner more relaxed than she had yet seen it. "The danger has passed," he told her as she emerged with a cup of chicory coffee. "Our scouts have tracked the outlaws 2 days' ride to the east. They will not return." Sarah Mae settled beside him on the step, noticing how the pendant had returned to its normal warmth and appearance. "I never did thank you properly," she said. "Thanks are not needed between friends," Running Bear replied. He was quiet for a moment, studying the settlement with thoughtful eyes. "My father spoke of more than your kindness at the river. He said you live alone here, that your people are all gone to the spirit world." The familiar ache of loss tightened in Sarah Mae's chest, but she nodded. 3 months now since Pa died. The consumption took him slow. "And you have no one to look after you? No husband or brothers or uncles?" "No one," she confirmed. "But I manage well enough. Pa taught me to work with my hands, and I can hunt some and grow enough vegetables to get by." Running Bear was quiet for so long that Sarah Mae began to wonder if she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her completely. "In 2 weeks, when the moon is dark, our band will move to winter grounds in the protected valley where Willow Creek begins, the place where the hot springs keep the water from freezing and game is always plentiful." He met her eyes directly. "My father wishes to know if the little sparrow would consider joining our flight for the cold months." Sarah Mae felt her world tilt on its axis. The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond anything she could have imagined, that for a moment she couldn't speak at all. Finally, she found her voice. "You want me to? To come live with your people? But I'm not. I mean, I don't know your ways." "Ways can be learned by one with an open heart," Running Bear said simply. "My father sees something in you that he has not seen in many years. He says you have the spirit of his grandmother, who could walk between 2 worlds without losing her soul in either." Sarah Mae's mind raced with possibilities and fears in equal measure. To leave everything she had ever known, to live among people whose language and customs were foreign to her, it seemed impossible. Yet what did she really have to hold her here? A drafty cabin, a few meager possessions, and the daily struggle to survive another winter alone. "What would I do there? How would I live?" she asked. "Grey Wolf Walking has no granddaughters," Running Bear explained. "His wife died many summers ago, and they were blessed with only sons. He grows old, and there are things that need a woman's touch. The preparation of medicines, the keeping of stories, the teaching of children. You would be welcomed as family, not as a stranger seeking charity." The pendant seemed to pulse gently against Sarah Mae's throat, and she found herself thinking of her father's words about kindness being repaid in unexpected ways. Had he somehow known that one small act of compassion might change the entire course of her life? I need time to think about it," she said finally. Running Bear nodded, rising from the stump with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all his movements. "Think well, little sparrow. When the moon is dark, we will pass through this valley one last time before winter closes the high passes. If you choose to come with us, be ready. If you choose to stay, know that you will always have friends in the high country." Sarah Mae spent the next 2 weeks in a turmoil of indecision. She walked through each day mechanically, tending to her small garden, mending her few clothes, and trying to imagine what her life might look like stretched out through the coming years. The prospect of facing another harsh winter alone, and all the winters that would follow seemed suddenly unbearable. Yet the thought of leaving everything familiar behind filled her with equal dread. The townspeople noticed her distraction. Old Pete Henley stopped by her cabin one afternoon, ostensibly to check that she had enough supplies, but really to satisfy his curiosity about the warriors who had saved their settlement. "Heard tell from young Billy Morrison that you've been offered a place with them Indians for the winter," he said, settling his bulk onto her front step uninvited. "Now, Sarah Mae, I know things have been hard for you since your pa passed, but that don't mean you should go running off with savages." "They're not savages," Sarah Mae replied quietly. "They saved us from men who would have done terrible things to this town." Pete waved a dismissive hand. "That was just business, girl. Indians look after their own interests, same as anybody else. But living with them? That ain't natural for a Christian girl like yourself." But Sarah Mae found herself thinking of Grey Wolf Walking's gentle eyes and careful English, of Running Bear's quiet dignity, and the way his warriors had appeared like guardian angels in Willow Creek's darkest hour. Were these the actions of savages? On the night before the dark moon, she knelt beside her narrow bed and laid out everything she owned. It made a pitifully small pile: 2 dresses, a few undergarments, her father's Bible, her mother's silver locket, a sewing kit, and the hunting knife her father had taught her to use. She could carry it all in a single traveling bag with room to spare. As she packed by candlelight, her fingers found the carved pendant that had started it all. In its smooth surface, she seemed to see her future branching like a river delta, one path leading to gradual decline and loneliness, the other to unknown challenges, but also to the possibility of belonging somewhere again. The Lakota band appeared in the early morning mist, like something out of legend, their horses stepping softly through the dew-wet grass. Sarah Mae stood outside her cabin with her single bag clutched in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had made her choice, but making it and living with it were 2 different things entirely. Grey Wolf Walking rode at the head of the group, his injured leg bound, but his bearing proud and strong. When he saw her waiting there, his weathered face broke into a smile that seemed to light the entire valley. "The little sparrow chooses to fly south with us," he said, sliding down from his horse with considerably more ease than he had shown at the river crossing. "My heart sings to see it." Running Bear appeared at her side, leading a gentle mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Moonbeam," he said. "She was my mother's horse. She knows the mountain trails and will carry you safely." As Sarah Mae settled into the saddle, the townspeople began emerging from their homes to witness her departure. Old Pete Henley shook his head disapprovingly, but others waved farewell with genuine warmth. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house even pressed a bundle of food into her hands. "You take care of yourself, child," the older woman whispered. "And don't you forget where you come from." The band moved out slowly, accommodating the pace of the pack horses and the elderly members of the group. As they climbed into the foothills, Sarah Mae turned back once to see Willow Creek shrinking into the distance below. The sight brought tears to her eyes, but they weren't entirely tears of sadness. 5 months later, when spring thaws opened the mountain passes again, a small group of traders arrived in Willow Creek with news that set tongues wagging for weeks. They spoke of a white woman living with Grey Wolf Walking's people, a woman who had become renowned among the tribes for her skill at healing and her gift for learning languages. They said she had married Running Bear in a ceremony that honored both their traditions, and that she was expecting their first child. Old Pete Henley scoffed at the stories, but Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly as she prepared her boarding house for the season's first travelers. She had always said that kindness had a way of finding its own reward, and some rewards were greater than anyone could imagine. And in the high mountain valley where the hot springs kept winter at bay, Sarah Mae, now called Little Sparrow Who Sings, placed her hand on her growing belly and felt her child kick with the strength of 2 worlds joined as one. The carved pendant lay warm against her throat, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude to the spirits of the river who had witnessed one small act of compassion and repaid it with a lifetime of love.